screenshots and things that I think will be helpful too. And some I don't think I've put on eCampus yet, but I'll add them, the ones that I haven't, to there later. So this is going to talk about light and color and how they're closely related. So this is like more of the physics side of art, that when I think about this stuff too much, it kind of makes it not fun. But I just wanted you to understand, like, there is science behind everything, and it does help to think a little bit about it as you're mixing colors and things. It'll help you make sense of it more. But without light, there is no color. And we perceive like light to be white, but it's really made up of all the colors of the spectrum. And depending on different colors that we see and that we're surrounded by, and the intensity of those colors and the light, they affect how we feel, but also how things appear. And so basically, according to physics, there are no colors in darkness, and that's the part that makes me sad, because it's like it makes me never want to turn out my light in my studio, because I'm like, my paintings aren't there. But really, every color we see, it's the surface of that material that's making us see that color. That's what's being reflected, and the other parts of the light are being absorbed. And so it's really all about energy, and all of these colors bouncing around everywhere. So we'll learn more about that today. As I said, colors can affect us greatly, and you all probably have a color that makes you happy or maybe sad. Maybe there's some that do multiple things for you, but we're manipulated quite a bit by color, and it even affects our decision making at times. Most of it's subliminal, and when you're kind of aware of it, you may be a little bit more cautious of things going forward. But light is really important too, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about with color, is not just all the different properties of color, but we'll also talk about value and things like that today as well and throughout the class. But we have to be able to understand light and value. This is a sculpture, of course, but you can see at different times of the day, the statue of Lincoln look completely different. And so the reason I show this is because sometimes I'll have students, they'll want to use the paint all right out of the tube, and then they don't mix any different values. And it makes it look more, like this left side, where it doesn't really look three-dimensional, and it doesn't really give it necessarily a mood that I think people would really want in their work. So we always want to remember that there's multiple properties of color and multiple elements that work along with color to create different values and an illusion of depth, if that's what you're going for in your work. So when we talk about light and shadow, we call that value or tone. And the value can really affect how we see things, even if color is involved. So here we see a value scale, and in the background, the outer rectangle fades from black all the way to white, and this middle rectangle is actually all the same middle gray. But because the background fades, it makes this side appear to be darker. So what does that mean with your work? Well, if you don't get your values right, it's not going to create the illusion that you want. It can actually mess with people's perception of your work. So in art classes, we often learn value first, and we learn to create a subtle gradation of value, and that helps our colors. When we start to work with color and value, it makes things look more three-dimensional as well. And this is an Italian word that literally means light and shadow, but it's used to describe artwork that has a really subtle gradation where you don't see any harsh lines in it. Now, color is a component of light, as I said, and it affects us in multiple ways. These are some of those different ways that, if you're interested in knowing them, you can. This is from a medical website, and it tells you some of the things. Now, this is the general population. Just like there are certain medications that make some people hyper and some people sleepy, the same thing I imagine with color. So these are just from scientific tests, but they found that blue is the most calming color, and it also lowers your appetite. Green is really good for helping with depression and anxiety and nervousness. It calms us down, maybe because of its connection with nature, like blue. Purple is really good for suppressing your appetite, and also supposedly it's the less harsh on your eyes. And so they say people that have migraines that's a good color to have for your walls. I think because of the darker value, it's not reflecting as much or as harsh parts of the light. Pink is also used in diet therapy, and pink actually makes you physically weak, and we'll look at that and later today. But it's they've done tests, like scientific tests, and when people are surrounded by pink, they're actually physically weak. They feel like a sense of fatigue. Yellow, orange, and red all increase your heart rate and also stimulate your appetite. And if you think about that, they all the fast food restaurants use those colors mostly in their advertisements and in their buildings. And even the food we eat has a lot of red and yellow dye added to it to make it even more appetizing. And so just something to think about when you're out there shopping. Yellow, as according to scientists, has the same effect on our brain as caffeine. And so they say that when you're surrounded by yellow, it helps you pay attention and improves your memory. But after a while, it also causes a sense of fatigue or tiredness from because it's so intense. Now, color can also be symbolic, and we are all aware of this. In our cultures, we have different colors that we use for wedding dresses or funerals, or to appear as being sexual or whatever. And so we have a lot of that. But then there's also personal color. We have our favorite colors. We have colors associated with memories. And so, the color is so complex. There's so many ways that it can really mess with us and also express all the things that we feel. So here, just showing you throughout history and different cultures, wedding dresses have been a variety of different colors symbolically. And this is a famous painting by who they believe was the person that invented oil painting, Jean Van Eyck. And so this was 1434 when this painting was created. And he also possibly invented oil paint and was able to paint this painting. When we call people masters, I remember as a student, I was always like, it's so weird that we call him a master. But can you imagine inventing a type of paint from oil and things in your house, and then mastering it to that level? And this is before Leonardo da Vinci. This is before the High Renaissance. This was the early Renaissance, and he mastered it to this level. This was before electricity, before you could buy paint. Artists had to make their own, and he had just invented a new type of paint, and then also mastered it at this level, which is just amazing. Now we can see as many as 10 million different colors. And so that's probably kind of scary for those of you that are in painting one, like, whoa, I only knew the color wheel. Well, don't worry, a lot of them are very similar and they're really hard to distinguish. So we tend to give general areas of the spectrum a certain name, and we'll look at that later today. And not everyone can see all of the colors, and we'll talk about that too. So a lot of people have color blindness. There's millions of people in the United States and even more around the world that suffer from different severities of color blindness. And when you're looking at this, you should be able, depending on the quality of your monitor or screen, you should be able to see a 6 and a 29. And I'll show you a way you can further test your color sensitivity later on today. But most people that are colorblind cannot distinguish between red and green. And so that's why you see a lot of those colors in these circles. And people have different severities of it, but mostly it's a male dominant disorder. But they have come up with a cure in a way, or at least a tool that helps with it that I'll show you in a minute. So I talked about this already. I think I've already said this, that color only exists in light, and the color we see is the color of the light that's being reflected. The spectrum was discovered by Isaac Newton, but you may not know this. Leonardo da Vinci had actually started in the 1400s, had started writing about color theory in some of his sketchbooks. But Sir Isaac Newton was the one that discovered the spectrum, where light passes through a prism separating into the bands of colors that we call a rainbow. And then he put those colors in order on the color wheel, and here's an early version of that. And he discovered that every color has a different wavelength, and we see red faster than we see other colors, and violet it travels slower. And so that makes sense when we think about things that are dangerous or that we're supposed to pay attention to. Often we use the color red to warn people because we do see it pretty fast. You may have heard other things like people get pulled over more with red cars and things like that. I don't know if all that's true. I actually maybe until a couple months ago, I had a red car for a couple of years now, and I never got a ticket in it. It was the first car I never got a ticket in. But last semester, I was driving from TW back to Northlake, and I was going a little too fast on 35. So now I've had a ticket in every car. But if you have a problem with speeding, one, slow down, but two, you may want to get a purple car and see if that helps too. So the color wheel has evolved quite a bit. With the first one by Isaac Newton, he actually also gave colors a music note because he believed color could stimulate your brain the same way different notes do. And there have been artists throughout history that played with that idea and kind of had audio with their visual art. And we'll look at one today. So this is the visible spectrum. This is a diagram, and then it actually photographed. You can see they're very similar. And these colors are also the way that they show up on the color wheel in a circle. And I think I've talked about most of this already. The local color, that's the color that we normally associate with objects when they're in full light. But we have to remember that those colors do change depending on the light and time of the year sometimes if it is outside. Now, we often use the words like black and white and gray and browns, and we call them colors, but technically they're not. White black is when all the colors are absorbed into the surface or all the energy is absorbed. White, all the light is being reflected. And then all the neutrals, there where the colors are canceled out, but we don't see a single hue. Okay, so all of the black, white, browns, they're grays, they're all considered neutrals. And so you can add them to any color scheme that you want. If you don't use color, let's say you just do black and white paintings or paintings with a lot of brown, we would call that an achromatic color scheme. The prefix a means without, and chroma means color. So it's kind of a lot of students, when you give them color scheme assignments, I've had several throughout the years think that that means they cannot use any other colors besides those colors in that color scheme, and they think that they have to use them in the same quantity, and that's never true. Whenever we use color schemes, you can use them in different quantities, and you can always add the neutrals unless you have a teacher that just says, you can't. Okay. Now, hue is a word that we use to describe the colors on the color wheel. So there's a limited number of hues. There's 12 on the color wheel. But then the color is a word that we use to describe like all the different mixtures of those and the mixtures of those with the neutrals. All right. We already talked value, but I did want you to realize that value is also a term we can apply to colors. Yellow is obviously a brighter value than violet. If you took a black and white photo of a color wheel, yellow would be the lightest and purple would be the darkest. Now, when we add black to a hue, we call that creating a shade. And when we add white to a hue, we call that making a tint. And tone is when we add gray to a hue. And these are ones that I hear people use incorrectly quite a bit, especially in like interior design, fashion design, and like in the makeup industry. I was watching some video the other day, and the YouTuber was like, "Oh, look at all these shades of pink," and I'm like, "Pink is a tint; it's not a shade." So we hear people use those words incorrectly quite a bit. Now, whenever another place that's really confusing is the automobile industry, because when people get their windows tinted, what do? They make them darker, right? So why? I have no idea. I'm guessing they didn't go to art school, but these are the proper terms, and you will have assignments where you are asked to, some of these terms, and you're going to need to know them or back to that vocabulary list so that you can understand the instructions. Now, chroma or intensity, that has to do with like how pure the hue is, and they're always going to be the most pure coming out of the tube. Some of you may have had teachers before that told you not to use paint straight out of the tube, and they probably told you that because a lot of times when students use paint right out of the tube, it can make the artwork look a little childlike or elementary. Not always. There are a lot of very successful visual artists that use really bright colors. So it really just depends on what you're wanting to do, and what is the intent behind it, what is your concept, all of that. So it just really depends. But if you're wanting to create a more representational painting, or you're working from observation, rarely in nature do we see like colors like we do when they come right out of the tube of paint, right? So we will talk about how to alter those colors if we are wanting to work more that way. Now, whenever we mix paint together, it's actually a subtractive method, because the more colors we mix together, the less light is being reflected. And we'll talk about next week when we get to working with color and painting one and some of these little charts or diagrams we're going to make. You all will have to make black for one of your assignments. And I remember the first time I had a teacher show us how to do that, I was like, whoa, I never knew, that you can make black. But with acrylic paint, it's pretty easy to do with ultramarine blue and raw umber. Mixing those two together, you can get a pretty good black. And then I've had other teachers that taught me other ways to do it too that were a little more complicated. But as you see, if you go to the paint store or the arts and crafts store, there's a whole lot of different blacks. Some have to do with where the pigment came from, and some have to do with the reflection or absorption, like how glossy or shiny it is. And so, there are different blacks for sure. I've even had teachers before tell me that I couldn't use black paint out of the tube. They didn't like it for some reason, and they said that it didn't work well with the other colors. And I think what they mean for that is if you're going to do a value study with paint of an object, instead of putting black for the shadow, you may want to mix some color with that black so that it works better with the other colors that you have, and it's not so absent of color. So those are the reasons that some teachers may say things like that. Now, you cannot make white paint from mixing colors together. That one, they do it with different chemicals, but it's one that you cannot mix, and the primary colors as well. So here are some of the alternative color wheels I talked about. So this is for using light. When we mix red, green, and blue light together, it will actually make white light. And I've seen this done in a theater class that I took. They demonstrate that. And then printers use a different color wheel. Their primary colors are cyan, magenta, and yellow. And then this is the, of course, painting color wheel, or what we see in most of the visual arts courses that you take. So the primary colors are yellow, red, and blue. And those occur naturally, and then they make all the other colors on the color wheel, the other hues. The secondary colors are orange, green, and purple, and they're made by mixing two primaries together. So blue and yellow make green, blue and red make purple, and red and yellow make orange. Now, you all have probably all looked at your kit already and saw that you have two blues, two reds, and two yellows. And we'll talk later today about why we have that, because remember when we looked at the spectrum, there weren't lines between each color, right? So we call an area yellow, and we call an area blue, and we call an area red. So whenever we're wanting to mix, let's say, a true green, I remember being a kid and just having like this one this one yellow and this one blue. And I was watching Bob Ross, and I was so excited. I'm like, I'm gonna paint with him. And then I went to mix my yellow and blue, and my trees did not look happy. They looked really sad. And it's because I didn't have like the blue and the yellow that worked really well together. And so we're going to learn today about how one of the yellows in your kit is going to be cooler, closer to the greens, and one yellow is going to be warmer, closer to the oranges. And the same with the blue. We're going to have one that leans towards the green side, and we're going to have a blue that leans to purple. And we're going to have a red that leans towards orange, and a red that leans towards purple. And when you know that, you'll be able to mix pretty much any color you see, except for, like fluorescent colors and things like that. So we'll discuss that more. Now, these little triangles are what we call the tertiary or intermediate colors, and those are made by mixing a primary and a secondary together, and they don't have their own unique name. Their name is the primary color, a hyphen, and then the secondary color. So this is yellow green, blue violet, red orange, and yellow orange. And you probably remember having crayons with those names on them as a kid. Now, these are some of the color wheels, and we will have, for painting one, you will have some assignments where you have to use color schemes, at least in the beginning. And they're not punishment. They actually kind of help you limit yourself so that you can find more I can't think of what I'm trying to say, but you can you'll find that you can do more when you limit yourself sometimes. Like you'll find more possibilities of ways of being expressive, and it will help your overall composition. And so we'll go over these more as we do different assignments, but the primary color scheme would be just using the primary colors without mixing them into each other. But you could, of course, mix them with neutrals. The secondary colors would be using just the secondary colors with the neutrals if you want. Complementary means they're colors opposite each other on the color wheel. So any colors that are directly across from each other would be complements. Now, when we mix those together, guess what we get? Neutrals. That's where we get our browns. And so you really can make your own brown paint too, if you want to. But of course, it's easier to buy a tube and use that. So we'll look at that as we go through color as well. Analogous means that the colors are neighbors or adjacent to each other on the color wheel, and they can be any two or more colors that are side by side, and they tend to have, they're more similar in terms of temperature. And they get really complex. There's split complementary where it's a color and then the two colors on the side of the complementary color. So it can be pretty intense when you get into some of these color schemes. These are some other ones I wanted you to know. Monochromatic, the prefix mono means a singular or one, and chroma means color or hue. And so this means using one hue and then different values, of course, and you could use the neutrals. Monochromatic color schemes usually are really moody because it's just that one hue, evoking usually an emotional reaction from the viewer. And I really like monochromatic color schemes. Analogous we went over, and then achromatic again means without using color or hue. And then complement, we went over those. And then these are just some more. Dyadic is two colors that are two colors apart from each other on a color wheel. A triadic means they're separated by a triangle on the color wheel, an equilateral triangle. So technically a primary and secondary color scheme are also a triadic color scheme as well. All right, so here I just wanted to show you, if you look in an art history book or an art appreciation textbook, you're probably going to see a lot of these color schemes used that you didn't notice before. Picasso went through an early period when he moved from Spain to Paris, where he used a lot of blue, and they call it his blue period. I've never heard that that's what he called it, but he was really young. He was in his late teens, early 20s, and he moved with a friend from Spain to Paris to try to make it as an artist. And he wasn't super successful at that time. He struggled to make it. And shortly after being there, one of his friend that he had moved with committed suicide. So he really was isolated and alone. But I think that's also when he kind of found himself. And that's when he had to learn to believe in himself and work through those hard times. And then obviously he became a super famous artist and made quite a bit of money making art during his lifetime. But I really like his early work. To me, it's more humble than some of his later work, which I like a lot of it. But and some of you may be like, I don't like Picasso. You know, he was a womanizer. And there's a great video called Love the Art, Hate the Artist, and that art assignment series that I told you all about on PBS. They have a YouTube channel, and it was really interesting because I find that quite a bit. And I know in today's world, you know, we live in a society where you know, people get canceled fairly easily, but sometimes we have people that do really amazing things that, you know, help people, but then at the same time they do hurtful things or have done hurtful things. And so I thought that video was really nice that they had, because it helps you learn to look for maybe something positive you could take from something negative. But his early work really has this really cold temperature to it because of his use of blue. And there's also kind of this loneliness, sort of a suffering sort of feel to his work. This is a self-portrait, and I feel like it could be a poster for a starving artist. We see his cheekbones are really defined, you know, as if he's really thin and possibly hungry. But yet there's still this kind of warmth in his mouth, like, you know, maybe there's something inside that's pushing him along. But during this series, he also painted people that were homeless, people that were panhandling, and they say that he had a connection to you know, those people because they were struggling to make a career just like he was. Now, this is another artist that really liked the color blue. Yves Klein was an artist that loved blue so much, and he would mix this pigment that was so blue. One paint company actually started manufacturing blue paint and named it after him. But he made solid blue canvas and made this minimal kind of color theory based art. And he just said he liked the color blue and he thought that it had healing properties to it. So he made solid blue canvases. And I've had students and friends and family before that were like, "That's not art. Anybody could do that." I'm like, they could, but he, you know, he did it. And I think you also have to. I get insecure about taking my work to galleries and entering shows, and you know, rejection never feels good. But I can't imagine, you know, walking into a gallery with just a blue canvas. You know, he had to be very confident and really believe in himself and be able to sell this idea of his to the public. Eventually, he started painting sculptures blue. He started adding like sea sponges that he dipped in that blue paint to his canvases. And I saw an exhibit that had several of his pieces in Fort Worth a few years ago that they had this big, it looked like a big sandbox just filled with that powdered blue pigment. And it really, there was an energy to it, and you could really see the light reflecting off of it. And so it's kind of interesting. Now, he became so obsessed with blue that he started doing, I'm sorry, my dogs are, I think there's a delivery or something. But the artist became so obsessed with blue, and he researched it quite a bit, and he discovered that the color that Isaac Newton had associated blue with sound, and so he had this full orchestra play the one note that Newton had associated with blue, while these women covered themselves in blue paint and made body prints on it. And then people sat in 20 minutes of them playing that one note, and then they sat in silence to kind of desensitize from that experience. So it was kind of interesting. I'm sure it was an experience that, you know, those people never forgot. These are just some more of his pieces. Another artist that really talked about color quite a bit was Mark Rothko. And I show him just because I wanted you to see some artists that were really passionate about color, and that's what their work was mostly about. But Mark Rothko, he had a really unique career. His family had immigrated from Europe, you know, in the early 1900s, and you know, he was living during the Depression in the United States and hearing about all the things happening around the world. and at the time had been studying every type of art you could think of. He tried his hand at making landscapes, portraits, cityscapes, city scenes like subways, and then he just found himself like, there's so much going on in the world. What can I really paint that summarizes it? And he finally thought, what if I just painted colors? I mean, colors are representative of our emotions. We talk about auras. We talk about the psychological aspects of color. What if I just painted the different emotions that I'm feeling in raw color? And so that's what he started to do. He would build these big canvases that were bigger than his height, and he would think about what he was feeling in that moment, and he would choose his colors, and he called these his color filled paintings. So here we see multiple different reds. Maybe maybe these were all anger, maybe one of them was passion, I don't know, but notice the edges are always kind of soft, and that's because our emotions are always changing. And so he wanted people to stand in front of these. He requested that galleries and museums have really low light when they display these, so that the light is really just reflecting off of the painting, and that when people see these, that it has those emotions reflect onto the viewer and makes you feel what he was feeling in that moment. Now, I know some of you are probably like, that sounds like some hippie, weird art stuff, but I have seen people standing in front of his work just crying before. And I don't know if they knew the story behind it or what, but it's interesting. It's almost like they're portals to like his soul or whatnot. But he became so famous for these, and during the 1930s, when times were really really hard, and it was so ironic to him because he had struggled as an artist for a while, but all of a sudden these big companies were wanting him to do these what would be millions of dollars today deals with his work, like putting him in their hotel lobbies and things like that. And he had a hard time with some of that. He realized that whenever you become famous, more people may look at your work, but less people truly see it. And I think that that's a sad thing about the celebrity status for a lot of artists, is people stop seeing quality just because you kind of become a brand, and that really made him quite depressed. And ultimately, his depression and alcoholism, led to, his death. And there is oh yeah, that was my next slide. The Rothko Chapel is in Houston. He was friends with the Manil family that created the museum in Houston. It's free for students, so I encourage you to go. The Manil has a beautiful collection of work, and right next to it is this chapel. It's a little, I think it's like an octagon or hexagon shape, and inside of it are several of his paintings, and it's used as like an interfaith peace chapel, and it's open to the public, and you can just go in and kind of sit and relax, and it's just very calming. And anyway, it was created in his honor, and I think he donated the pieces for it. Now, we talked quite a bit about color, and I know I may be rushing through some of this, but I'll post this lecture so you can go back and look, and the PowerPoint is already posted for you. But colors can also be warm, or considered warm or cool. We can divide the color wheel in half, and the really kind of from yellow, green to red, orange, and red we call the warm side, and then of course this would be the cool side. And this has a lot. This can really help your paintings come along really well if you're wanting to create a sense of depth in your work. Warm colors, they expand and come towards us, where cool colors contract and recede. So if you use a lot of really warm colors, or even add warm colors to, like, let's say your highlights with white or something, it will make them come to the viewer more. And if you look at this just for a little bit and your eyes start to get tired, these circles almost look bigger than these ones over here, and that's the illusion of color. And so the same thing with the cool colors, they tend to contract and go back. So we'll talk more about that as we work on some of our assignments in this class. Now, one artist that really mastered color and created a whole new way of making art was Seurat. And this was all happened around the mid to late 1800s. There were a couple of things that led to artists starting to work more abstract. One was the invention of tube paint. So all of a sudden, artists could stop making paint and they could actually go buy it at the store. And that allowed them to go work outdoors, or what we call plein air painting. And that means that they would take like their easels outside. And you've probably seen some of the movies with like Van Gogh and Monet, where they would go out to the field and paint from real life. And then the other thing was the invention of the photograph. The camera had been around since the Renaissance. They called it the camera obscura, and they would use it to find compositions and to trace. Like they would look in it and they could draw the reflection. But slowly people started experimenting with light sensitive chemicals, and they invented the photograph in the mid 1800s. And then that really freed painters from having to do portraits and things like that. Not everyone, some people continued to do that, but a lot of people, when they started going outdoors, and then they weren't necessarily always doing commissions the more traditional way, they realized while they were outdoors, the light would change. And sometimes, they would take their time in their studios working from their memory and from their sketches. They were able, they would go outside, and within an hour, the color and light would change completely. And they were just like, whoa. So artists like Monet would bring several canvases, and he would do several paintings in one day trying to capture the light and color before it changed. And we called that Impressionism. And then as more and more artists did that, the faster they worked, the looser their texture and brushwork got, because they just didn't really feel the pressure to capture a sense of realism. And a lot of them were focused more on color and light than they were about recreating, realistic images. But Seurat realized that you could isolate the color, and from a distance, it would actually blend together to make other values and other colors. And so we call him the father of pointillism. And he would do these large paintings that just had a bunch of dots. And when you get up close, you could see these different colors. Now, critics at the time were very harsh towards a lot of the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painters. And they actually said that Seurat's paintings looked like he fired a shotgun of color onto the canvas. But they didn't know it was very scientific. And he did a full value study in charcoal or graphite before he would ever start painting. And he would do it the same size as his canvas, and he would have that to reference. I saw an exhibit in New York about 10 years ago that maybe it was a little longer than that, but it was at the Modern Museum of Art in New York, and they had all of his charcoal drawings, and then some of them they had the painting next to it that he had done from the drawing, and they were just beautiful. Like mass gestures and value studies that were really nice to look at. But it was very scientific. And even though this was a reaction to the photograph, this is what inspired pixelization, which is now, of course, how we have digital photography. So it's really interesting how art and science go hand in hand like that throughout history. So here I have just some different color schemes to show you that you may not always recognize the color scheme right away, but you'll start to notice that more. But here we see this painting, it has a lot of tints, but when you really look at like the color wheel and then this painting, you see reds, you see red oranges, you see red violets, and all of these like analogous kind of warm colors. Here we see a lot of cool tints of colors, analogous almost on the other side. Here we see a complementary color scheme. If we really isolate the colors, we see red and green, but yet you can see they've been mixed with some of the neutrals, creating different values. So like I said, there's usually a lot of times there's a color scheme used. We don't always recognize it because they're mixed with the neutrals and all that. So here we have two uses of two complementary colors. I think that would be the tetrad color scheme. We have red and blue and green, and then we have blue and orange kind of in the same composition, and then it kind of looks like a little bit of yellow and purple too. And then of course some artists choose not to use color, and they stick more with a neutral palette and work more achromatically. Now I'm going to share with you, this is, I made this earlier today, and I don't know if you guys can still see me or not, but I have it here. These were the colors that I typically use in my palette when I teach painting 1 and 2. Some of you had emailed me asking about, you had different colors. Well, a couple of the professors, we had to get together and agree on a kit, so we compromised some. So your colors may be a little bit different. But what I wanted you to see is you have 2 reds. You have I think your reds may have been a little bit different, but you have a warm one and a cool one. The warm one I like to use is cadmium red, and the cooler red is the Algerian crimson red. Now, some of your paints straight out of the tube, they're going to be they're going to almost look kind of transparent, and then also they're going to just look almost black when they dry. And so that's why another reason we always add other colors to them. So for some of the ones that are naturally darker, when you just use them alone, I added white to them so you could see the various pinks that they make. And you're probably like, this looks totally orange. But the only reason it looks orange is because it's next to this other red. Here we have 2 yellows, cadmium yellow, and then a lemon yellow. The lemon yellow, you can see if you stare at it long enough, it almost looks a little yellowish green. And then the cadmium yellow almost has like an orange quality to it as well. And then the blues, ultramarine blue is really warm, and phthalo blue is cooler. And if you wanted to make, like, let's say, a more true purple, if you mix the crimson red with the ultramarine blue, that's going to make a better purple. If you were to use this cadmium red and this phthalo blue, it's going to be like a really kind of brownish looking purple. And same here, if you use the lemon yellow and the phthalo blue, you'll almost get like that turquoisey, like really rich kind of Kelly looking green that a lot of people like. So you'll learn that as we go throughout the class. And one thing we'll do quite a bit is add a little bit of white to our colors to brighten them up, because they're always going to dry a little bit darker. Now, the only neutrals I usually use before we had these kits was I would have students get titanium white, raw umber, and Mars black. But your kit came with some additional browns, so that's just more for you to, play with. And but I wanted you to see, because I know some people were asking, why they got different colors. But that will all come out more as we get into our assignments next week. Okay. So as you look at your colors, I don't have the list memorized, but I shared it with you earlier. You'll be able to see which is the warm. And I wasn't using all golden paints with this because I still haven't received mine. I ordered some more, and then I think I'm supposed to get a kit eventually. So you can use whatever brands you want if you're having to supplement, those of you in painting too. And the good thing about acrylic is you can mix acrylic with other acrylics. As long as it's